Mr. Laurent arrived at the Grand Parisian Hotel just as the golden sunset touched the tall glass windows. The place was alive with quiet elegance, the kind of beauty that didn't need to speak too loudly. The marble floor gleamed under his polished shoes, and a faint tune from the lobby piano floated in the air. Guests moved about with gentle smiles, and the scent of fresh lilies drifted from the reception desk. But Mr. Laurent noticed none of this. He was too busy checking his expensive watch and sighing impatiently, as if time itself should obey him. He was a tall man in his late 40s, wearing a dark suit that cost more than a year's rent for most people. His gold cufflinks shone under the soft chandelier light. To anyone who looked at him, he appeared successful, confident, even powerful, but those who worked in the hotel knew another side, the side that looked down on everyone else. "Welcome back, Mr. Laurent," said Elliot, the concierge, with a polite smile. Elliot stood behind the polished desk, his uniform neat and his posture straight. He had kind eyes and the calm voice of someone who had seen every kind of guest. Mr. Laurent gave him a short nod, not even making eye contact. "I hope my suite is ready. I don't like waiting." "Of course, sir. Everything is prepared just as you requested," Elliot replied warmly. Laurent handed over his coat and gloves with a quick, careless motion, as though Elliot were invisible. To him, hotel workers were just part of the furniture, useful but forgettable. Elliot, however, didn't seem to mind. He had served all kinds of people, kind ones, rude ones, and those who thought kindness was a weakness. He had learned to smile through it all. As Laurent walked away toward the elevator, his phone rang. He answered loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "Yes, the deal went through," he said. "They always agree in the end. Money talks." Then he laughed, the sound echoing sharply through the quiet lobby. The guests nearby glanced at him. Some smiled politely. Others turned away. Elliot quietly went back to arranging the desk, but his fingers tapped the wood in a soft rhythm, almost musical, like a tune only he could hear. Upstairs, Mr. Laurent entered his luxurious suite. Everything was perfect. The view of the Eiffel Tower, the fresh flowers, the chilled champagne waiting on ice. Yet, instead of feeling joy, he felt only boredom. He sat by the window watching people below and muttered, "All that walking, all that talking, and for what?" In truth, Laurent's life was full of success but empty of peace. He had more money than he could spend, more houses than he could visit, but his heart felt strangely hollow. Every morning he woke up to meetings. Every night he drank expensive wine alone. Somewhere deep inside he knew something was missing, but he didn't know what it was. Later that evening he went downstairs again, dressed in a perfectly fitted tuxedo. The hotel was hosting a dinner for wealthy guests and investors, the kind of event where everyone smiled too much and spoke too little truth. Laurent loved such events because they gave him an audience. As he passed through the lobby, he noticed Elliot standing quietly by the entrance, helping an elderly lady with her luggage. The way Elliot spoke, gentle, patient, respectful, made her smile with genuine warmth. Laurent almost scoffed. Waste of effort, he thought. No one remembers a polite concierge, but Elliot wasn't being polite to be remembered. He simply cared. He had learned long ago that kindness didn't need applause. During the dinner, the chandeliers glittered and violins played softly in the background. Laurent took his place among the city's elite. He laughed loudly, told stories of his business triumphs, and pretended to be charming. People nodded, some out of respect, some out of fear. They all knew his money carried weight. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes occasionally drifted toward the piano in the corner of the room. No one was playing it that evening. It sat silently, waiting. For some reason, the sight of that piano stirred something small in him. Maybe curiosity, maybe envy, maybe a forgotten memory, but he quickly brushed it aside. When the dinner ended, Laurent walked back through the quiet corridors toward his suite. The night was still except for the faint hum of the city outside. As he passed the lobby, he saw Elliot again, still at his post, though most guests had gone to bed. The concierge was alone now, straightening some papers and humming softly. It was a tune Laurent didn't recognize, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. For a moment, Laurent paused. Something about the melody made him stop. It was gentle and warm, like a conversation without words. He wanted to say something, perhaps to ask what he was humming, but pride held his tongue. Instead, he turned away and walked to the elevator. As the doors closed, Elliot continued his quiet tune, his hands moving in small, graceful gestures, as if invisible keys were beneath his fingertips. And though Laurent didn't know it yet, that same melody, simple, honest, and full of feeling, would one day change his life. That night, in his grand room high above the city, the millionaire couldn't sleep. The sound of that faint, imaginary piano still echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of money, power, or success. He dreamed of music. The next evening, the hotel buzzed with excitement. A grand dinner was being held in the ballroom. Chandeliers glimmered like stars and laughter floated through the air. Guests in elegant dresses and black suits filled the room, glasses of champagne clinking as the music of conversation rose and fell like a tide. Mr. Laurent, as always, entered late. He liked being noticed. When he walked in, people turned their heads. His dark tuxedo fit perfectly, and the confidence in his stride made him seem taller than he was. He smiled, that well-practiced, proud smile that didn't reach his eyes. As the waiters pulled out his chair, he scanned the room like a king looking over his court. "Ah, Laurent," said a familiar voice. It was Madame Rousseau, a beautiful woman known not just for her looks but for her wit. She was in her 30s, graceful and intelligent, with a sparkle in her eyes that made people listen when she spoke. Laurent admired her, though he would never admit it aloud. She had turned down his offers for dinner before, and that only made her more interesting to him. "Madame Rousseau," he said, bowing slightly. "You're looking exquisite tonight," she smiled politely. "And you are as charming as ever, though I hear your charm comes at a price." Laurent laughed loudly, enjoying the attention. "Everything of quality does," he replied. The people around the table chuckled, though some rolled their eyes quietly. Everyone knew Laurent loved to talk about money. The evening went on with fine food and wine. As the waiters cleared plates, the talk turned to art and culture, a topic Laurent often used to show off. "You see," he said confidently, "true culture is understanding beauty through ownership. A great painting, a fine violin, these things belong in the hands of those who can appreciate their value." Madame Rousseau tilted her head slightly, amused. "Ownership?" she asked softly. "Does one need to own beauty to understand it?" Laurent raised an eyebrow. "Of course. Appreciation without possession is like tasting a wine you can't afford. A poor man might see art, but only a cultivated man understands it." The guests laughed, though not everyone found it funny. Madame Rousseau sipped her wine slowly. "So tell me, Mr. Laurent," she said after a pause, "you love to speak of culture. What is your art? What do you create?" He hesitated for a second and then smiled. "I build businesses. I shape futures. That is my art. But can you play music?" she asked suddenly, glancing toward the piano in the corner of the ballroom. The question caught him off guard. Laurent forced a confident laugh. "Music? Oh, I leave that to the entertainers. I prefer the music of numbers, profit, progress, success." Her lips curved in a playful smile. "A pity," she said lightly. "Because you see, a man who can play that piano might win my heart." The table went quiet. Someone gasped softly and then laughter broke out. The words were teasing, but they cut through Laurent's pride like a blade wrapped in silk. He felt heat rise in his face. Madame Rousseau continued, her voice sweet but daring. "I was only saying, true elegance is not in wealth but in grace. And grace, well, that's something you hear in music, not in money." Laurent laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Then perhaps I should hire the best teacher in Paris," he said stiffly, "and learn it by next week." "Or perhaps," she said softly, "you could simply listen." The other guests exchanged amused looks. The proud millionaire had just been gently mocked by a woman who refused to be impressed by his fortune. The conversation moved on, but Laurent's mind didn't. He felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and anger. How dare she speak to him like that in front of others? And yet, there was something in her words that lingered. Grace is something you hear in music, not in money. As the dinner ended, Laurent excused himself earlier than usual. He walked through the nearly empty lobby, his steps echoing on the marble floor. His reflection followed him in the tall mirrors, handsome, rich, powerful, and yet he felt small. The grand piano sat in the corner, quiet and untouched. Its black surface gleamed under the chandelier's glow. He stopped and stared at it. He could buy 100 pianos if he wanted to, but he couldn't play a single note. That thought stung his pride more than anything Madame Rousseau had said. He looked around and noticed Elliot, the concierge, standing by the desk. The same calm, polite man as always. "You there," Laurent called. "Do you know who plays this piano?" Elliot turned, surprised by the sudden question. "Sometimes, sir, the guests play it. And occasionally the staff, and after hours, the staff," Laurent repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean, you?" Elliot smiled faintly. "Only when no one is listening, sir." Laurent frowned, but something about that answer stayed with him. "Well," he said coldly, "if you can play it as well as you serve, then perhaps you're in the wrong profession." Elliot bowed slightly. "Perhaps, sir, but I'm quite happy where I am." Laurent walked away, shaking his head. "Ridiculous," he muttered. "A concierge and his piano." But deep down, curiosity began to whisper in his chest. That night, he poured himself a glass of wine and stood by the window, the city glittering beneath him. Madame Rousseau's laughter echoed in his memory, followed by Elliot's calm words. Somewhere below, the faint sound of piano notes drifted up, slow, delicate, alive. He went to the balcony and leaned forward. Someone was playing in the lobby. The melody was soft but carried emotion, sadness mixed with beauty. It wasn't the music of a beginner. It was the music of someone who had lived and lost, yet still found peace. Laurent stood there, listening, frozen. He didn't know who was playing, but the sound reached a place in his heart he didn't know still existed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel rich or powerful. He just felt human, he whispered to himself, almost without realizing it. If only I could play like that. But downstairs, the concierge kept playing, unaware that his quiet midnight music had just begun to change a millionaire's soul. Late that night, the Grand Hotel was quiet. The guests had gone to bed and the lights in the ballroom were dimmed to a soft golden glow. Only a few lamps in the lobby still burned, casting long shadows on the marble floor. Outside, Paris hummed faintly, the distant sound of cars, a soft breeze and the sleepy rhythm of a city that never truly rests. Mr. Laurent stood by his window on the top floor, staring down at the glittering streets below. Madame Rousseau's words played again and again in his head like a cruel song. "If you can play that piano, I'll marry you." He laughed under his breath, not because it was funny, but because it stung. How easily she had made him look foolish in front of everyone. He, a man of power and wealth, reduced to a joke about music. He poured himself another glass of wine, but it didn't taste as good as it usually did. The taste of pride gone sour. He told himself he didn't care, that she was just a woman who liked to tease. But deep down, something about that moment had shaken him, not just her laughter, but the truth behind her words. He put down the glass and looked toward the lobby far below. The faint sound of music drifted up again. At first, he thought it was in his head, maybe a memory, but no, the sound was real. Someone was playing the piano downstairs. He frowned. Who could be playing at this hour? He muttered. Curiosity, pride, and maybe a touch of loneliness pushed him to find out. He put on his robe, stepped into his slippers, and quietly left his suite. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. As the doors opened, the gentle melody became clearer. It was soft, slow, and deeply emotional, a piece that spoke of both sadness and hope. The notes danced gently through the empty hall, touching the air like whispers. Laurent stepped into the lobby and saw the source. There, under the warm glow of the chandelier, sat Elliot, the concierge. He wasn't wearing his uniform jacket, just a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, fingers gliding over the keys with effortless grace. Laurent froze. The man he had dismissed as just a concierge was playing like a professional, no, like an artist. His back was straight, his eyes half closed, and his hands moved as if they belonged to the piano itself. For a long moment, Laurent didn't move. The melody wrapped around him, soft and haunting. It was not the loud, showy music played in grand concerts. It was simple, pure, and full of feeling, the kind of music that told stories without words. When the last note faded, Elliot lifted his hands gently from the keys and sat still for a moment, as if savoring the silence. Then he sighed and smiled to himself. Laurent clapped once. The sound echoed in the quiet lobby. Elliot turned quickly, startled. When he saw who it was, he stood up immediately. "Mr. Laurent?" he said politely, straightening his shirt. "Forgive me, sir. I didn't mean to disturb anyone. The piano needed tuning and I thought I'd test it." Laurent smirked. At midnight? Elliot smiled softly. Music doesn't always keep office hours, sir. The answer caught Laurent off guard. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Not rudely, but honestly. He walked closer, his footsteps sharp against the marble floor. Where did you learn to play like that? Elliot hesitated. Before I worked here, I studied at a conservatory. Piano performance, but life had other plans. My father fell ill. I needed a stable income. He shrugged lightly. Music became my comfort instead of my career. Laurent looked at the piano, then back at him. So you're telling me the concierge of this hotel could have been a concert pianist? Elliot smiled again, a humble one. Perhaps. But I don't regret my path. I still play. That's enough. Laurent frowned, unsure why that answer bothered him. Enough? He repeated. You call this enough? Serving people, carrying their bags, answering phones? Elliot's eyes softened, but his tone stayed calm. Every life has its own music, sir. Some just play in different keys. Laurent didn't reply. He stood there, staring at the man who had unknowingly humiliated him without saying a word. There was no arrogance in Elliot's voice, no hidden pride, only peace. It made Laurent feel strangely small. You play well? Laurent said finally, turning to leave. Too well for a lobby. Thank you, sir. Elliot replied quietly. As Laurent walked toward the elevator, the melody started again. Slower this time, deeper, almost sad. He stopped halfway and turned back slightly. Elliot was playing without sheet music, eyes closed, lost in the music. For the first time in his life, Laurent didn't feel superior. He felt envious, not of Elliot's talent, but of the serenity on his face, the kind of calm no amount of money could buy. He returned to his suite, but sleep refused to come. The sound of that piano filled his thoughts, each note like a question he couldn't answer. Why did it move him so deeply? Why did he feel so hollow in comparison? He sat by the window again, watching the dark city glow under the moonlight. Somewhere below, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. He whispered into the quiet room, "If I could play like that, maybe I'd understand," but he didn't understand, not yet. All he knew was that for the first time he felt truly curious about something other than money or power. He didn't realize it then. But that night marked the beginning of a strange friendship, one that would humble him, teach him, and change the sound of his life forever. And as the city slept, the concierge wiped the piano keys gently, unaware that his quiet midnight habit had awakened something lost in the heart of a millionaire. The next morning, the hotel felt alive again. Sunlight poured through the tall glass doors, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the lobby. Guests chatted softly, the sound of luggage wheels rolling over marble floors filling the air. It was a normal morning for everyone except for Mr. Laurent. He had slept little. The sound of Elliot's piano playing had haunted him through the night, replaying in his mind like a song that wouldn't fade. Every note carried something that money couldn't buy: peace, beauty, soul. And the thought of Madame Rousseau's teasing words still burned his pride. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching Elliot quietly help a family check out. The concierge smiled politely, handing them their tickets and wishing them a safe journey. He looked calm, steady, unbothered by the chaos of the morning rush. Laurent walked down slowly, his expression sharp. When Elliot noticed him, he greeted him with the same respectful tone as always. "Good morning, Mr. Laurent. I trust you rested well?" Laurent gave a short laugh. "I didn't rest at all thanks to your little concert last night." Elliot's face turned slightly red. "My apologies, sir. I didn't think anyone could hear me at that hour." "Well, I did," Laurent said coldly. "You play rather loudly for a man who works the front desk." There was a moment of silence. Some of the other staff nearby looked up, uneasy. Elliot bowed slightly. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again, sir." Laurent studied him for a moment, waiting for him to look offended or defensive. But Elliot's face remained calm. That calmness irritated him even more. "Tell me something," Laurent said suddenly, leaning closer. "Do you enjoy showing off? Playing piano in the middle of the night? Was that your way of impressing the guests?" Elliot shook his head softly. "No, sir. I play because it helps me think. Music keeps me peaceful." Laurent frowned. "Peaceful," he repeated mockingly. "That's a luxury word for people who don't have real problems." Elliot smiled faintly, though his eyes looked thoughtful. "Perhaps, sir. But peace isn't something you buy, it's something you choose. The words struck deeper than Laurent expected. He turned away quickly, pretending to check his watch. You speak like a philosopher, he said sharply. Maybe you should write books instead of checking in guests. Elliot said nothing. He only gave a small nod and went back to his work. Later that afternoon, a few guests gathered in the lounge area, enjoying tea and pastries. Among them was Madame Rousseau. She looked radiant as always, wearing a simple white dress that seemed to glow in the sunlight. When she saw Laurent, she smiled and waved. Ah, Monsieur Laurent, she called out. I hope you've been practicing your piano skills. Her tone was playful, but everyone turned to look. The memory of last night's teasing hung in the air. Laurent forced a laugh. I'm afraid I've been too busy earning my fortune to waste time on keys and notes. Madame Rousseau tilted her head. Oh, but music isn't a waste. It's food for the heart. Surely even a millionaire's heart needs feeding. Laughter rippled through the group. Laurent smiled tightly, his jaw tense. He wanted to escape the conversation, but pride wouldn't let him. Perhaps, he said, but not everyone has the talent. Some of us build while others entertain. Both have their place. Just then Elliot passed by with a tray of tea. Madame Rousseau noticed him and said kindly, Elliot, you play the piano, don't you? I heard someone in the lobby last night. It was beautiful. Elliot paused, unsure whether to admit it. But before he could answer, Laurent said sharply, Ah yes, our talented concierge. Apparently he thinks he's Chopin. The words were meant to sound light, but they carried the sting of mockery. A few guests chuckled politely, not sure if they should laugh. Elliot smiled politely, though his cheeks flushed slightly. Thank you, sir, he said quietly. Madame Rousseau frowned slightly. Don't mock him, Monsieur Laurent. It takes courage to play from the heart. Some men can't even try. Laurent's face stiffened. Are you implying something, madame? She met his eyes evenly. Only that true class isn't in what you own. It's in what you give. And last night your concierge gave us beauty without asking for anything in return. Laurent felt the laughter around the room turn sharp like quiet knives. He forced another smile. Well then, he said, perhaps next time we'll let him perform at dinner. I'm sure the guests would enjoy a free show. Madame Rousseau didn't laugh. It wouldn't be free, monsieur, she said softly. It would be priceless. Laurent's pride burned like fire. He nodded stiffly and walked out of the lounge before his anger betrayed him. The moment he stepped into the quiet hallway, he clenched his fists. Every word she had spoken echoed in his head, and worse, he knew she was right. He went outside to the terrace, needing air. The city stretched before him, beautiful and alive. Yet all he felt was emptiness. Below, through the glass doors, he saw Elliot sitting again at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. He was alone, his head bowed, as if lost in thought. Laurent stared for a long moment. He couldn't decide what he hated more. The fact that the concierge could play so beautifully, or the fact that everyone admired him for it. But somewhere, deep down beneath his anger, another feeling began to grow. Not hate, not envy, but something quieter, something uncomfortable. Respect. He turned away quickly, but the faint sound of music followed him once again. It was soft, almost forgiving, and though he didn't realize it, each note was already chipping away at the walls around his proud heart. That night, as he lay awake once more, he whispered bitterly to himself, They mock me now, but we'll see who laughs last. He didn't yet know that this very thought would lead him to make a choice that would change his life forever. The next morning arrived with soft sunlight spilling through the hotel's glass doors. Guests came and went, suitcases rolling and voices blending with the gentle hum of the city outside. Everything looked ordinary, calm, polite, predictable. But inside Mr. Laurent, a quiet storm had begun to grow. He had avoided the lobby all morning, embarrassed by the memory of Madame Rousseau's words and the guests' laughter. Every time, he thought of Elliot's calm face and quiet grace. Something inside him twisted. The man hadn't said a cruel word, hadn't even defended himself, and yet somehow Laurent had felt defeated. By afternoon, His restlessness became unbearable. He couldn't focus on his phone calls or business meetings. The numbers, contracts, and charts that usually excited him now looked meaningless. Finally, he gave in to his curiosity, or maybe to something softer that he didn't yet understand. He left his suite and walked downstairs. The lobby was quieter now, the rush of check-ins over. Elliot stood behind the counter, arranging documents, his movements neat and careful. Laurent watched him for a moment before stepping closer. "Elliot," he said, his tone controlled but serious. The concierge looked up, polite as always. "Good afternoon, Mr. Laurent. How may I assist you?" Laurent hesitated for a second, then asked bluntly, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elliot blinked in surprise, unsure if this was another joke. "The piano, sir?" "Yes, the piano. Last night." Laurent crossed his arms. "You play too well to be self-taught. I've heard professionals who sound less alive than you." A small smile appeared on Elliot's face. "That's kind of you to say, sir. I studied music for a few years. Piano performance at the Conservatoire de Lyon." Laurent raised his eyebrows. "The Conservatoire? That's impressive. So why are you here?" Elliot didn't seem offended. He looked down for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Life doesn't always follow the sheet music we plan, sir," he said quietly. "My father became ill. The medical bills were high, and I had to leave the conservatory. Hotels pay better than concert halls." Laurent frowned. "You gave up your dream? Just like that?" Elliot shrugged lightly. "Sometimes dreams change shape. I still play, just not on a stage. When I play here, even alone, I feel the same peace I felt back then. Music never left me. It just found a different place to live." The words hit Laurent like a soft hammer, gentle, but impossible to ignore. He thought of his own life, the endless meetings, the shallow parties, the hollow compliments. He had spent years chasing money, power, status, and yet standing here in front of this quiet man, he felt oddly small. He leaned against the counter, trying to hide his discomfort behind a smirk. "You speak like a poet, Elliot. Tell me, do you believe music is really that powerful?" Elliot looked up, meeting his eyes. "Yes, sir. It's the only language that doesn't lie." Laurent blinked. "What do you mean?" "When people talk, they hide behind words," Elliot explained softly. "But when they play, their hearts speak. You can hear honesty in music. Joy, sadness, fear, love. It never pretends." Laurent fell silent. He didn't know what to say. He had never thought of music that way. To him, it had always been background noise, something played at parties to fill the silence. Finally, he said almost to himself, "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who lie beautifully. Maybe that's why music feels strange." Elliot smiled gently. "Then maybe you should try listening more, sir." Laurent laughed quietly, not mockingly this time, but almost with self-awareness. "Listening, yes, that might be a start." He turned to leave but paused. "Elliot," he said, "if I wanted to learn, just a little, not to perform, just to understand, could you teach me?" Elliot looked surprised. "Teach you, sir?" "Yes. I can pay you, of course." Elliot shook his head. "You don't need to pay me, Mr. Laurent. If you're serious, I'll teach you because music should be shared, not sold." Laurent frowned slightly, unused to such generosity. "You'd teach me for free?" Elliot nodded. "On one condition, that you promise to be patient with yourself. Music doesn't respond to pride." Laurent gave a half smile. "That might be harder than the piano itself." That evening, when the guests had gone and the hotel grew quiet, Laurent returned to the lobby. Elliot was already there, standing by the piano. The chandelier light reflected softly off the polished keys. "Are you sure about this?" Laurent asked, a touch of nervous humor in his voice. Elliot nodded. "Completely. Sit down." Laurent took a deep breath and sat at the piano. The seat felt unfamiliar, almost intimidating. Elliot sat beside him and guided his hands gently to the keys. "These are the notes," he said softly. "Every melody begins with simple steps. Don't rush, just feel." Laurent pressed a key. It made a small, uncertain sound, fragile but real. He looked at Elliot, who smiled encouragingly. "Again," Elliot said, "and this time, don't think about how it sounds. Think about what it feels like." They spent an hour there, playing single notes, simple patterns, and small chords. Laurent made many mistakes, but for the first time in years he didn't feel angry about failing. He laughed when he missed a note. He even asked questions, and Elliot answered each one with patience. When they finished, the clock showed midnight. Laurent stood feeling strangely lighter. "You know," he said quietly, "I haven't learned something new in years. It feels good." Elliot nodded. "Music has a way of reminding us who we are beneath everything else." Laurent looked at the piano one last time before leaving. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Elliot smiled. "Tomorrow." As Laurent walked back to his suite, he realized something surprising. For once, he wasn't thinking about business or deals or Madame Rousseau's laughter. He was thinking about sound, about touch, about patience. He didn't know it yet, but that first lesson had already begun to tune something inside him. Not just his fingers, but his heart. The days passed quietly after that first lesson, but something in Mr. Laurent began to change. Every night, after the guests retired and the hotel lights dimmed, he would find himself walking down to the lobby where the grand piano waited. The room always smelled faintly of polish and fresh lilies. Elliot was usually there, waiting patiently, a soft smile on his face and a cup of tea ready on the side table. The lessons became their secret routine. Laurent, the proud millionaire who once mocked the concierge, now sat beside him like a student. Awkward at first, clumsy with the keys, but curious. His fingers, used to holding pens and signing contracts, struggled to find rhythm. Every wrong note made him wince, but Elliot never laughed. "Don't worry about mistakes," Elliot would say in his calm voice. "Music forgives easily. It only asks that you try again." One night, Laurent frowned at the keys. "You make it sound simple, but it's not. I've spent my life mastering difficult things, business, negotiation, but this? It's impossible." Elliot chuckled softly. "You mastered control, sir. But music isn't about control. It's about letting go." Those words lingered. Laurent looked at his reflection on the piano's glossy surface. A man so used to power that he didn't remember what it felt like to simply learn. Slowly he began to relax. His fingers grew steadier, his touch lighter. And for the first time he started to listen, not just to the piano, but to the silence between the notes. One evening, after nearly a week of practice, Elliot taught him a simple melody, a tune soft enough for a beginner, but beautiful enough to stir emotion. Laurent played it slowly, each note uncertain but heartfelt. When he finished, Elliot nodded with genuine pride. "See, you're beginning to speak the language." Laurent smiled almost shyly. "It's strange. When I play, my thoughts stop. It's like breathing differently." Elliot nodded. "That's what music does. It teaches you to listen to yourself." The words struck deep. Laurent realized how rare it was for him to truly listen, not just to others but to his own heart. For years he had lived surrounded by people who praised him, feared him, or wanted something from him. Elliot wanted nothing at all. The next morning, Laurent surprised everyone. He came down early, earlier than usual, and greeted the staff politely. The same employees who once avoided his gaze now looked at him with surprise. He asked Elliot for coffee, said thank you to the bellboy, even smiled at a maid passing by. Something had softened in him. Later that evening, as Elliot prepared for another lesson, he found a small box resting on the piano bench. Inside was a silver metronome, elegant and old-fashioned but beautifully crafted. There was a note beside it in neat handwriting. "For my teacher, from your most impatient student." Elliot smiled, touched more deeply than he expected. When Laurent arrived that night, pretending to act casual, Elliot simply bowed and said, "Thank you, sir. It's perfect." Laurent shrugged, trying not to look sentimental. "Consider it a token of appreciation. I don't give out compliments easily, or gifts. That's why it means more." Elliot replied softly. They began the lesson as usual, but something felt different. There was less stiffness, less formality. They laughed when Laurent played a wrong note, and when he finally managed to play a short tune without stopping, Elliot clapped his hands. "Well done, sir." Laurent grinned, a real grin, not his usual proud smirk. "I suppose that deserves a glass of champagne?" "Perhaps after you master both hands," Elliot teased. That night they talked more than they played. Elliot shared stories from his time at the conservatory, nights filled with music and friends, the joy of performing before an audience, and the pain of leaving it all behind when his father fell ill. Laurent listened quietly, realizing that the man before him carried more strength and grace than most of the great men he knew in business. "Do you ever miss it?" Laurent asked gently. Elliot smiled faintly. "Every day, but I learned something important. When life changes the tune, you must learn to dance to the new rhythm." Laurent sat back, thinking about those words. He had always believed success meant control, but now he wondered if true strength was about acceptance instead. As the clock neared midnight, Elliot stood and stretched. "Same time tomorrow?" Laurent nodded. "Tomorrow." "And Elliot?" "Yes, sir?" Laurent looked at the piano, then back at him. "If you ever want to play for an audience again, I'll make it happen. A real concert, not as a concierge, but as an artist." Elliot blinked, taken aback. "That's kind of you, sir, but—" "No," Laurent interrupted gently. "It's only fair. You've given me something I didn't even know I'd lost." Elliot didn't ask what that was, but he smiled knowingly. When Laurent returned to his suite that night, the air felt lighter. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his own success. He realized that the gesture, a simple metronome, a quiet offer of gratitude, had given him more peace than any $1,000,000 deal ever could. And as he drifted to sleep, he thought of the music, of Elliot's steady patience, and of how strange it was that a concierge had become his teacher, and perhaps his friend. He didn't know it yet, but the lessons he was learning weren't just about piano. They were about humility, kindness, and rediscovering the melody of life he had long forgotten. Weeks passed, and something remarkable began to happen inside Mr. Laurent. The proud, impatient businessman who once measured success in numbers was slowly being replaced by someone quieter, humbler, and strangely happier. Every evening he still met Elliot by the piano. At first he came for the lessons, but soon he came for the peace that followed them. The stress of his meetings, his endless phone calls, and his loud, demanding world seemed to fade away the moment his fingers touched the keys. He no longer came in sharp suits and gold watches. Sometimes he arrived in rolled-up sleeves, his tie loose, smiling in a way no one in his office had ever seen. "Sir," Elliot said one night, after Laurent finished playing a simple but moving tune. "You're improving quickly." Laurent laughed softly. "Or maybe you've just become too kind." "No," Elliot said, shaking his head. "You've started listening. That's all it takes." Laurent thought about that. Listening. It sounded so easy, yet it had taken him years to learn. A week later, Madame Rousseau returned to the hotel. Her presence still turned heads wherever she went. She had heard rumors that the once arrogant millionaire was spending his nights learning piano from the concierge. At first, she didn't believe it, but curiosity made her stay longer than planned. That evening, the hotel hosted another dinner. This time, Laurent didn't arrive late or make a grand entrance. He walked in quietly, greeted a few guests, and even helped a waiter pick up a fallen napkin, something unthinkable for the man he used to be. Madame Rousseau noticed immediately. "Monsieur Laurent," she said teasingly, "you seem different. Have you finally learned how to play that piano I mentioned?" Laurent smiled, but not the proud, polished smile she remembered. This one was calm, real. "I've been learning," he said. "But not just the piano. Other things too." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what has life's great teacher been showing you?" He looked toward the corner of the room, where the grand piano stood gleaming under the chandelier. "That humility has a better sound than pride," he said softly. "And that music isn't about perfection. It's about honesty." Madame Rousseau's teasing expression faded. She looked at him for a long moment, surprised by his sincerity. Later that night, after most guests had left, she lingered in the lounge. Laurent was still there, talking quietly with Elliot near the piano. She watched them, the millionaire and the concierge, laughing like old friends. It was a sight she never thought she'd see. "Play something," Elliot said to Laurent. "Now? With her here?" Laurent asked, his eyes widening slightly. Elliot smiled. "You've been practicing for weeks. It's time you share what you've learned." Laurent hesitated. The idea of playing in front of Madame Rousseau, the same woman who once mocked him, made his palms sweat. But then he remembered Elliot's words. Music doesn't respond to pride. So he nodded, took a deep breath, and sat down at the piano. The lobby was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. His fingers trembled as they touched the keys. The first notes were uneven, a little shaky. But then he found the rhythm. The melody grew smoother, softer, and full of emotion. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. Every note carried the story of his change, the laughter, the humility, the late nights spent learning something that money could never buy. When he finished, silence filled the room. Elliot smiled proudly and Madame Rousseau clapped softly, her eyes bright. "That," she said, walking closer, "was beautiful." Laurent laughed quietly. "Beautiful? I made at least 10 mistakes. Maybe," she replied gently, "but it's the most human thing I've ever heard you do." Her words stayed with him long after she left. For the first time, he didn't feel embarrassed by his mistakes. Instead, he felt alive, as if every wrong note had carried a truth about who he really was. In the following days, Laurent's transformation became clear to everyone. The hotel staff no longer feared him. He greeted them kindly, remembered their names, even asked about their families. Guests noticed too. The cold businessman had turned warm, approachable, even kind. He started spending less time in meetings and more time observing people, listening, learning. When someone complained at the hotel, he didn't snap. He understood. And when he saw Elliot helping an elderly couple with their bags one morning, he walked over and helped too without hesitation. One night, as they sat by the piano again, Laurent asked quietly, "Do you think it's strange that all this started because of a challenge, a joke from a dinner table?" Elliot smiled. "Sometimes the smallest moments change the biggest hearts." Laurent nodded, looking at the keys. "You were right, Elliot. Music really doesn't lie." He began to play softly, his eyes half closed, the notes flowing gently through the quiet lobby. There was no audience, no applause, just sound and sincerity. Elliot listened, proud and peaceful. When Laurent finished, he said with a faint smile, "You know, I used to think I owned everything I needed, but it turns out I owned everything except myself." Elliot didn't answer. He didn't need to. The music had already said it for him. That night, as Laurent looked out at the city from his suite, he realized how different everything felt. The lights of Paris still glowed the same, but his heart didn't. For years, he had been chasing things that glittered, while the real gold and kindness, passion, simplicity had been sitting quietly, waiting to be found, and he found it in the most unexpected place. Not in a mansion or a deal, but in the quiet hands of a concierge who played beautifully. Several weeks later, the hotel's grand lobby looked the same. Polished floors, shining chandeliers, soft murmurs of guests, yet something in the air felt different. Mr. Laurent, once known for his cold arrogance, now carried himself with quiet warmth. The staff noticed. The guests noticed. Even the walls seemed to echo a softer rhythm, as if the building itself approved of his change. One evening, the hotel prepared for another formal dinner. This one was special, an anniversary celebration for a longtime business partner of Laurent's. Madame Rousseau was among the invited guests. She hadn't seen Laurent since that night he played for her and Elliot. She had heard the rumors, the proud millionaire, transformed into a man of grace, but she wanted to see it with her own eyes. When she arrived, she found him standing by the piano, not boasting, not commanding attention, simply talking and laughing with Elliot, who had been invited to join the evening as a guest, not as staff. Laurent had insisted on it. "Good evening, Madame Rousseau," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope the night finds you well." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I see the piano has done its magic after all." He chuckled softly. "Perhaps it wasn't the piano," he said. "Perhaps it was the teacher." As dinner ended, someone from the guests called out, "Mr. Laurent, play something for us again." Laurent hesitated. No, I'm not a performer, But the crowd cheered and Madame Rousseau crossed her arms, smiling knowingly. You did say you've been learning, monsieur. Don't disappoint your audience now. Elliot leaned toward him and whispered, Play, sir. But this time don't play to impress, it's time to play to think. Laurent nodded slowly. He took his seat at the piano. The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that waits for something sincere. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. The melody was simple, the same tune Elliot had first taught him, but now it carried something deeper. Each note spoke of his journey, pride breaking into humility, loneliness finding peace, and a man rediscovering his humanity one key at a time. No one spoke. Even the waiters paused to listen. The notes floated like soft light across the room, fragile, honest, and full of heart. When he finished, the silence lingered for a few seconds. Then the applause came, warm and genuine. Madame Rousseau's eyes glistened with emotion. She walked up to him and said softly, I was right that night, you know. Laurent looked up, smiling. Right about what? She leaned closer, her voice playful yet sincere. If you could play that piano beautifully, I'd marry you. Laurent laughed, shaking his head. Then it's a good thing I'm still learning. I wouldn't want to rush something so important. The crowd laughed and even Elliot chuckled from the side. But behind the humor, something real had changed. Not just between Laurent and Madame Rousseau, but within Laurent himself. Later that night, when most guests had gone, Laurent found Elliot standing by the piano, gently closing the lid. You played beautifully tonight, sir, Elliot said with quiet pride. Laurent shook his head. No, Elliot, we played beautifully. You just used me as the instrument. Elliot smiled. No, sir. You found your own melody. I only reminded you it was still there. Laurent looked at him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Elliot, you're more than a concierge. You're an artist, and you've given me something I could never repay. Elliot hesitated before shaking his hand. You already have, sir. You listened. Those words stayed in Laurent's heart. A month later, the hotel hosted a charity gala. To everyone's surprise, it was organized by Mr. Laurent himself. The cause? Scholarships for young musicians who couldn't afford music school. Elliot helped arrange it, of course, though Laurent insisted his name be placed beside Laurent's on the program. That night, Elliot performed again, this time not for empty lobbies or passing guests, but for an audience that truly listened. Laurent sat in the front row, proud not of his money but of the friendship that had changed him. When the final song ended, the applause filled the room like a wave. Laurent stood, clapping until his hands stung. After the event, he found Madame Rousseau by the balcony. The city lights shimmered in the distance. She smiled softly. You did a good thing tonight, Laurent. The man I met months ago would never have done this. He nodded. The man you met months ago didn't know how to listen. They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of Paris blending with the distant echo of the piano. Finally, she said, So tell me, do you still play? Laurent smiled. Every night. Not for anyone else. Just to remind myself that peace isn't bought, it's practiced. She smiled back. Then keep playing. You might just deserve that promise I made after all. He laughed quietly, his heart light. Downstairs, Elliot was locking up the piano room. As he did, he heard faint footsteps. Laurent had returned. Elliot, he said softly. Thank you. Elliot turned, smiling. For what, sir? For teaching me something I never learned in all my years of success. That wealth isn't measured in what we own, but in what we give. Elliot's eyes softened. Then I suppose you've finally become richer than all your millions could make you. Laurent smiled, placed a hand on the piano and whispered, Play beautifully, Elliot, always. And with that, the two men stood there for a moment, silent but connected. Teacher and student, servant and master no longer. Just two souls bound by the music that had rewritten both their lives. Outside, the Paris night glowed softly, and through the open window, a gentle melody floated out once more, not perfect, but human, honest, and beautiful. It was the sound of redemption. It was the sound of redemption.